let's add another question. And we'll make the checkbox text empty. There we go, now we can line that up properly. And we are going to add a label for yet another question. Let's name our checkbox to be question box 3. And make this one question label 3. And the text for this label will be, does the event loop use lots of processing power? And that can be question 3. Okay, so now we want to account for this question also. Now we could do this in the same way we did before and use another and put question box 3.checked equals true, because the event loop does use a lot of processing power. If any one of them are not answered correctly, this whole line's conditions overall would not be met, so we go to this part. We could do it that way and it will work. So if that is how we put it, then we get the correct answer. If we change just one of those, we get the wrong answer. And every combination except the right combination of 3 correct answers will give us the wrong answer. But as we add more and more questions, this is going to get quite messy. It's going to have many, many ands, and we'll have to check for a lot of conditions in a single if statement. So at this point, it's getting a little bit... So we're going to redesign this a bit so that no matter how many questions we have, our code will not get too complicated. And the way we're going to do this is through several smaller if statements first, which count up the number of correct answers. Now, since I used count, what could we use to count correct answers? Well, the answer for that is a variable. And the type of variable we would use is an integer. So let's declare dim count as integer. Now, I am giving that a default value of 0. However, integers do actually default to the value of 0 anyway if you do not give them a value. But just to make it clear that 0 is the starting value we want, we explicitly state that we want it to equal 0 here. So now, let's comment out these lines of code so that they are not being used. And we are first going to ask, is our first question correct? So we do if question box 1.checked equals true, then, and we are going to then, in this case, if it is true, we make count increase by 1. Count plus 1. So only if our question box 1 is checked, actually this one needs to be false, because if it's not checked, then that is the right answer. So if question box 1.checked is false, then we increase our count by 1, so that's our correct answer count. Otherwise we do nothing, because we do not have an else statement for this if block. Now let's add another if statement. The question box 1.checked equals true, then, and once again we can just use this. So let's copy and paste that, because it needs to be question box 2 here. So if question box 2.checked is true, then we increase count again. Let's do one for question 3. So I copied the whole block here. So all we need to do is change question box 2 to question box 3. Everything else can stay the same. So for each question, we are just having a single simple if statement that checks whether something is true and then increases our count by 1. So now what we can do is we can actually be a bit more adventurous with our final if block. So we can say if count equals 0, then message box And if our count is 0, that means the user has got every single question wrong, because none of these conditions would have been met. Therefore, count could never have been increased by 1 at any point. So if it's 0 by this point, then they have got nothing right. So we will put, sorry, you got 0 out of 3. But if we use else now, that would only allow us to check if they got nothing right, or they got at least something right. So if we want to, within the same if statement, check specifically that they got a count of 1, then we need to use the else if keyword, and then check if count is equal to 1. Then we do something. And in this case, we are going to say you only got 1 out of 3 correct. So currently, we are first checking if our count is 0, do this, and ignore anything below that line in the rest of that if block. But if count is not 0, we move to the next check, which is else if count equals 1, do this. So once that has happened, we now have something that can control multiple data values. So let's have another else if. Else if count equals 2, then let's put another message box. Good attempt. You got 2 out of 3 correct. So now we have 3 possible outcomes all checked in this if, else if block. And finally, we could use another else if for getting 3 correct answers, or we could just type else, because if count is not 0, 1, or 2, then it must be 3, because it can only increase a possible of 3 times if they got all of these correct. So we can save ourselves a bit of time by just typing else rather than else if count equals 3. So we'll put a message box again, which says, excellent job, you got 3 out of 3. And if. So now, what's going to happen is, if our program gets to this point and count equals 0, then we want the message box to say, sorry, you got 0 out of 3, and nothing else in this if block will happen. Because when we use if, else if, and else, like that, we only go through the block of text, or the block of code, until we reach 1 correct condition. Then we skip all of the rest. So if this one is correct, everything else is skipped down to the end if. If this one is not correct, we look at the next. So if count equals 0 is not correct, we look at the next thing, which is the else if count equals 1. If that one turns out to be true, then we do that line of code and we skip the remaining lines of code for the if block. Same for else if count equals 2. If we get to this point, we do this line of code and skip the rest of it, which will be this bit here. Or if we get to the else, then that means none of our other conditions have been met, so we have to go to our final possible outcome, which is this line here. You cannot have an else anywhere else in the if block. So you cannot have if and then else followed by else if. You must check for all of these specific conditions, like count equals 1, count equals 2, count equals 0, before you use else to cover any other remaining condition. Else is always the last thing in your if block if you include it. So what should happen when we run our program is, when we press my results without ticking anything, it should tell us that we've only got 1 out of 3 correct, because all of them are currently unchecked, which means only our first thing here will be counted. Because these ones need to be true to be counted, that will not happen. We will not get any more than 1. So we do that, and it says you only got 1 out of 3 correct. Bad luck. If we try ticking that one, sorry, you got 0 out of 3. And now let's try doing it all correctly. Excellent job, you got 3 out of 3.